Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to resilience, business continuity, COVID, well-being, emergency management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Now, today's show, we've got a variety of topics to talk about today, and I want to welcome to the show Mr. Robert Hall. Robert, welcome to the show.
Alex, thank you very much, and welcome to you too and your audience.
And I reached out to Robert because I came across Robert on LinkedIn with one of the postings, an email notice, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting topic. Reached out to Robert, and luckily and happily, he agreed to be on the show, and we've got a few things to touch base on. Now, Robert, I know you and I have touched base a few times via email and not necessarily face-to-face, screen-to-screen, shall we say. And so I know a little bit about you, but for our global listeners and viewers, could you take a minute or two and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into what we do?
Of course, how to condense your life in a minute. I spent half my working life in the military, in the British Army, and probably tell from my accent, I'm a Brit. I've also worked for the government in part of their National Crime Agency, which is equivalent to the FBI. But then I transferred out into business, and I worked for a variety of organizations, Barclays, British American Tobacco, G4S, but all in resilience and risk management. And that's really where my interest stemmed from and my expertise has grown out of. My last post was as executive director of an organization called Resilience First, which I set up with a colleague. And it's really designed to help business understand what resilience is about and how they, as a business community, can promote it. I left at the beginning of last year, so I'm technically now retired, but I spent a lot of my time writing about resilience and authoring a book which is about to come out, and a series of articles which I'll let you kindly pick up on. So how about that?
Well, first of all, happy retirement.
Thank you.
And second of all, congratulations on the book. And we're going to be talking about that in, I think, our third segment. So I hope everybody listens and gets a little peek on what might be in there. So our first segment, I've got some questions for you. And my first one is, what is your understanding of resilience for companies and communities?
Yeah, well, resilience is an interesting word, which is very popular. You type it into Google, you'll come up with millions of entries. And it's a bit like strategy or crisis. What do you actually mean by strategy? So my understanding of it, and it's been shaped over time, is really an ability to survive and thrive, I suppose, in a very short sentence. By that I mean ability to overcome a shock, stress, and bounce forward. I use the word forward rather than bounce back, because I think resilience is about adapting to change that stress has brought about and cause you to learn and change the way you face further shocks and stresses. So it's about building back better, not just building back, but building back better. And if you are truly resilient, then you learn from those experiences and are better capable of meeting those future challenges in a more experienced and knowledged way. So I think it's an important word to try and get round. There isn't a precise definition. Or if you interviewed people on the street, they'd give you as many variations of resilience as there are people. But I think it conveys an interesting and increasingly popular concept of not just business continuity, but actually building back and being able to cope more successfully in the future.
Yeah, I think if you do go through an adverse situation, whatever it may be, as a person or an organization, if you are building back, when you declare that situation over, quote unquote, you should be better positioned than where you were when it started.
Yeah.
So going back means to me, you didn't learn anything and nothing
That's
changed.
absolutely. Yep. No, you got it absolutely right there, Alex. And the other thing I would say about it is it is really a journey, not a destination. There isn't a fixed endpoint for this, because you will never be fully resilient, because you're always learning and you're always meeting new challenges, new shocks and stresses. And therefore you go on becoming hopefully more resilient over time. And there is no one solution. Again, it doesn't help with the solution. But everybody's got their own goals and objectives. And, one person isn't resilient and another person is, because there are varying degrees of resilience. You can be resilient to particular, but not resilient to something else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very fluid concept, but I think it's important to realize that we go on being resilient over time.
Yeah, I think it's like trying to nail pasta to the wall. It's not
Yes.
it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Trying to pigeonhole one definition for resilience when everybody, every organization, and every community all experiences something different,
Yeah.
even if they're experiencing the same basic scenario. How things are set up, the makeup of the community, how it's laid out, how the organization, the nature of its business is all going to have a different experience. So how can you all pigeonhole it and say, well, this is what it means?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do use some examples of being resilient. A Syrian in a refugee camp has a totally different concept of resilience and an ability to be resilient than someone living in rural Suffolk
Mm-hmm.
or out of Toronto. We all have different environments to cope with, and we can be good or bad according to our own backgrounds, really. And that brings in another interesting concept: is it nurture or is it nature? And I think there's a mixture of both in being resilient.
Well, my next question, because you kind of hinted at this a little bit in your response there, uh, in the light of the pandemic and the Ukrainian war right now,
Mm.
how has our approach to resilience changed?
Well, I think it's changed significantly, really. Besides raising the awareness of, and you can't put a paper these days without that word popping up. But I think those two serious systemic crises, the pandemic and the Ukraine war, have really highlighted to many people just how volatile and unpredictable the world has become. No one thought we would see a European war on our continent after the Second World War, but we have one. And a lot of people were predicting a pandemic, but people generally put it out of their mind. It really did shock us in terms of the of it, global, systemic. So I think the first thing I would point out is I think people's awareness of risk because of the volatility of the world. I think people now are looking slightly further beyond the normality of what is around the horizon, over the horizon, around the corner, and being willing to contemplate some fairly serious challenges we have. How effectively they are in coping, measuring coping, understanding that, I don't know, but I think there's certainly an awareness that we are in a much more unpredictable world. And I think if you want to climax to it, it's climate change. I mean, we are in a very unpredictable state of play, and we therefore need to be resilient as much as we can. The second thing I think is a change is about supply chain and the way we have to cope with disruption. And I think both the pandemic and the Ukrainian war have shown us that it's no longer sufficient to be having a system that's just in time. We've tend to grown up with always just in time. Stocks are always 2 days out. Whereas now, because things are so disruptive, can be so disruptive, I think people are beginning to realize we need a just in case capability, because we just don't know what to do. And that has a lot of consequences for cost and storage and redundancy. But I think it's one of the key messages that business has taken away from those disruptions, that we have to have a little bit more in our system.
Interesting. I like the just in time to just in case. Because there was for quite a few years, and it was really around Y2K, especially right after Y2K. I ran into we're not going to worry about what if scenarios anymore because nothing happened at Y2K. So just focus on the basics: a fire, a flood. But now, just in case, we're thinking, yeah, but that fire could be on the other side of the world and still impact us. Think of the volcanoes in Iceland and what was the other one, Indonesia or Malaysia, somewhere around there, that stopped travel and industries and stopped society for a while.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think this unpredictability is something we just have to. We're not going to be able to change it very much. It's going to probably get worse. So we have to be more resilient in dealing with that. But it's also thrown up an interesting concept that one can't easily predict. One can't predict what is coming up with many of these large challenges. And hence, if you all go down a risk register approach, to sketch out every risk you can possibly imagine, you can be better assured that the thing that's going to happen is the one you didn't actually for. And so you end up with either a massive file of potential risk you review every year, as businesses do, or you look more at the generic consequences of what is going to happen, the generic impacts, rather than the specific causes. Because no one would have predicted the Ukrainian war, but you can bet that such events will disrupt your supply chain, will disrupt the way your staff work, whether they can come into the office or not. And hence, looking at those generic consequences takes you away from looking at specific, trying to figure out specific potential risks, which are endless. And many of those consequences are common. So if it's a flood or it's a volcano, you know that your supply chain is likely to be disrupted if you have a large supply chain. What are you going to do that would allow you to respond to that without necessarily having boats ready to float in a river, or some gas mask for a volcano? You need the generic responses that will cater for everything and anything, without again a massive file of registers. So I think that's been an interesting development, with people recognizing that we just can't keep these risk registers building up. They're just getting too big.
Yeah, some of them have been huge that I've seen. My next question is, because we only have about 3 minutes left in this segment, believe it or not. But how do you think we can go about measuring our resilience in organizations?
That's a very good question. And it's made more difficult by our earlier conversation that resilience is a very fluid term. Like management, I guess, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But it is very difficult to do. There are no absolutes on this. So if anyone's looking for a nice chart, they can just box off and get an answer. It's not going to happen. But I think we can do a lot to help ourselves. Firstly, by disseminating best practice, raising standards, written standards, which are useful to a degree. They can be a bit of a tick box arrangement, but nonetheless, standards are there. We can also try and measure our own resilience through self-assessment, I guess, which is very much like marking one's own homework. But there are categories which you can break resilience down into. And you can then try and have a set of measures, statements, which you can look at and see how well you are comparing. So, if I was going to break resilience down into some key components, I would be using words like people, places, operation, performance, and process. So each of those have a bit more of a handle around, which you can ask questions to say, are my people prepared for a disruption? Is my location suitable for disruption? So you can start measuring it in that way. And people are doing that. We've come up with Resilience First has come up with a process of doing that. But generally, the approach has been very much around cities, comparing Toronto with London, Jakarta. And that has some merit to a point, but because these cities, where you are and where I am out of London, are massive, and there are so many different communities within them, but all have different levels of resilience.
Mm-hmm.
All very well to say, as some have, that Toronto is a very resilient city, but I bet you would confirm that parts of Toronto aren't as resilient as you would like them to be. So you do end up with an indices that is a bit too broad. So you have to take these variants in mind before you say, I am resilient. I've got a score of 89 out of 100, because I think you could unpick that.
Mm-hmm. On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking with Robert Hall today. In our next segment, we're going to talk about the UK government's resilience framework. You don't want to miss that. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.